Welcome. And again, just to keep reiterating, I really appreciate any reactions that you might have. And if you like it, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And I will try and answer them in, responding to you. So, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And I would tell you that today, as we get into poetry, it is really quite challenging. And certainly for someone like me, who was not given a yeshiva training as such, as a child, but we'll do the best we can. And because it's poetry, we understand poetry sort of starts to stretch the measure of meaning and stuff like that. And hopefully you'll find some great beauty in the way Rashi, reflecting the tradition, interprets some very challenging phrases and words and expressions. So we already started into the poetry, which represents Bilam's prophecy and his attempt to curse the Jewish people, which of course he fails to do, and in fact does exactly the opposite. And there's really some very deep stuff going on here. David had asked a question yesterday, it was off the recording, as to the greater meaning of what was going on here. And I'm not going to respond to it right this second. I did yesterday, but it was off record, I'm sorry to say. Spoiler alert. So here we are. Ki merosh tzurim enenu. So the first sentence had said, how can I curse the Jewish people? How can I curse Israel? So ki merosh tzurim erenu. Literally, it means from the tops of rocks I see him. Umigvaot, and from the heights Ashurenu, I perceive him. It's a synonym for Arenu. Hein am levadad yishkon. Hein, indeed, am, a nation, levadad yishkon. It dwells by itself. It dwells solitarily. Uvagoyim lo yitchashav, and is not counted amongst the nations. Excuse me once. Thank you. So as I mentioned, this is poetry. This is biblical poetry. You see the parallelism going on here. Instead of using meter, biblical poetry uses the meanings of the words, and this way of paralleling thoughts. Again, that's something to think about too, in what way that actually functions as poetry, and whether or not the very fact that you have a statement that's repeated in different words, what are the implications of that? Does it is this a sense of the fact that we're struggling, that the poet, him or herself, is actually trying to subtly say, I have feelings and thoughts that I cannot express simply in one sentence, that I want you to try and milk out as much as you can, whatever meaning you can from here, metaphoric and otherwise. Here we go into the Rashi. Ki merosh tzurim arenu, for I see him from the top of rocks. So, the implications of these words. So, ani mistakel, I perceive, I look at berashehem. I look at their beginnings, their tops. Uvetchilat shorshehem, and at the origins of their roots, the beginnings of their roots. V'ani ro'eh, and I see. So look at how he's taken Rosh Tzurim and understood it as symbolic, as a metaphor, right? for looking at the very beginnings, their very beginnings of a nation, right? Va'ani ro'eh otam, and I see them, meyusadim, so that would be established, right? V'chazakim, and strong, ketsurim, like rocks. So again, what do rocks connote? Ugvaot halalu, and like the rocks, and these halalu, these mountains, right? Heights, al yedei, by means of, here we get to it. Avot, their patriarchs, and please notice it says the imahot, and their matriarchs. So the idea of looking back at the very origins of us, of our identity as a nation, and looking back at the lives of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, and seeing them as being exemplars, and also of who we are supposed to identify with ourselves. And not only that, but that in that very strong beginning of the nature of their faith, their relationship with the divine, is great merit, that we have tremendous benefit and strength from what they started. Ein am levadad ishkon. Indeed, it is a nation that dwells by itself. Hu asher zaku lo avotav, that is which its ancestors merited for him. In other words, the benefits we have today based on what our ancestors did, the kinds of lives they did, lishkon badad, to dwell in a solitary way, ketargumor, as the Targum suggests. Uvagoyim lo yitchashev, so the parallel thought, and amongst the nations it is not counted. What do we mean by there? So he says tetargumor. This follows the Targum's translation. And again, the Targum, this Aramaic translation of the Hebrew, is in itself a running, not only translation, but commentary, especially when we get into these kinds of passages, which are poetry. And of course, trying to translate poetry from one language to another has to be actually impossible, at least to do it just simply in a literal kind of way. Lo yihiyu ne'esin kala. They will never come to an end. They will never, and here the word is from like Vayachulu, Hashamayim Va'aretz, that passage in Genesis where it talks about the heavens and the earth were completed. But there's a completion in the sense of ending. So they are not going to be destroyed, in other words. They will never come to an end. They will never perish. Im sha'ar ha'umot, with the other nations. So I think here they're talking about, so we look back at civilizations that came to an end, like the Egyptian civilization, the Babylonian one, Rome, Greece, although of course, in a sense, Western civilization is, as all of you know, right? That is something we inherited from the Greeks, but the Greek civilization in its own self, the Greece of today is not the Greece of several millennia ago, but they certainly have left a heritage, if you think about it, Greek thinking and the power of it and its implications. However, this is talking about as a nation here. So we have these two great traditions. Where the Eastern traditions fit in this is sort of an interesting question as to whether they're part of some kind of Semitic thinking. I'm not sure. I mean, we do have well, I'm thinking on my feet here, but I would certainly raise that as part of the tradition, and whether or not that also represents part of what Shem represents. So he says, like the other nations, and it says, Ovdei Gilulim, idolaters. So I think, go ahead, please.
you said that the Greek nation is not the same that it was in ancient times.
Correct. Correct.
Are we?
That is a great question, Lauren. The argument has been this. I've heard an argument that wants to say that, in fact, we got missed up. Perhaps the story about the Khazars, this this kingdom that lived in Europe, in Eastern Europe, where the king decided to become Jewish, take on Judaism, and on the other hand, I know that there are Hasidim who trace their roots way back, but I don't know that we can trace our roots way back in that sense. So I think you raise a legitimate question.
Well, I mean, you're talking right now about the biological
Correct,
makeup,
I am,
but that's not the only issue here
Yeah.
about whether or not we're the same people.
Well, one of the interpretations of Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, is that we're actually addressing Jacob. That when we say Shema Yisrael, we're saying, "Hear, Jacob, Adonai Eloheinu, the Adonai we believe in, that we have made into our Elohim." The Eloheinu has to do with the relationship we have with Adonai, okay? Adonai Echad is the same Adonai. So I really, and I was thinking of this as I was preparing this material, because it talks about the nations that are idolaters. That leaves a lot of people who are not idolaters and yet would identify with other nations. And understanding the nature of idolatry, which is the denial, right, of anything transcendent. And the truth is that there are other religions, some of which seem to have a direct connection to Judaism, such as Christianity and Islam, but there are other religions that don't. But also, I to the extent that I understand them, do not exhibit idolatrous practices. And the truth is, there's more idolatry going on in our own civilization, whether people identify as Jews or don't identify as Jews. This denial of anything more to the world than the need to acquire money or acquire power or acquire those sorts of things. That is my understanding of idolatry, as opposed to a level of understanding that as human beings living in this amazing existence, that even existence itself is something that is ever beyond our understanding, in even little elements of it. And the very fact that we can even talk about something called understanding is that we need to devote our lives to trying to be more than just satisfying our needs. So that has to do. So this is when he's talking about umot uvdei gilulim. Even though possibly in this context, and given the context of the times when these things were written, they were more clearly defined. I don't think they're so clearly defined anymore. I think there are people who, you've heard me say this, I mean, I'm just simply saying it in other ways, but in some ways I don't feel I can emphasize it enough, that looking from a universal point of view, there are other great religions, and I don't feel insecure about my belief in Judaism because of admitting that there are other great religions that have great thoughts and profound ideas that are against idolatry, about living an idolatrous life. And that's how I would interpret these particular statements. So I appreciate your critique, and I think you've got a good point. So, I mean, I like to think that, we do have this direct descendancy, that it's true that the 10 northern tribes got mixed up into the rest of the world, but that the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and through the Babylonian conquest, have retained a certain level of identity. So I don't know if you want to respond. I'm happy to give you that chance, Lauren.
I'm okay, thanks.
Okay, you bet. Thank you for bringing it up. So here he's talking about this point about the fact that the end of idolatry is going to happen. May not have happened yet, but it is going to come to an end. And he quotes Jeremiah here, chapter 30. Ki e'eseh kala, he says, Jeremiah says explicitly, I shall make an end, this is God speaking, b'chol hagoyim, amongst all those nations, etc. Einan nimnim im hasha'ar. So this is Rashi now, right? They are not counted amongst the others, these nations that are going to come to an end. Davar acher, another interpretation. Notice how long this Rashi is, because the poetry tends to be very, very concentrated in terms of meaning. Another interpretation. Keshehem smechin, right? That when and he's talking now, of course, about Israel, right? Or the Jewish people, however you want to understand that, right? When they are happy, when they're rejoicing, ein uma smecha imahem. Other nations do not rejoice with them. So how true that is, I think it's relatively true, but I think we can see, at least perceive, a certain measure of truth to that people, that, when you ask yourself some of the roots of anti-Semitism, right? Some of those roots have to do with a very deep spiritual and psychological jealousy, you might say, right? Shne'emar, as it states, Dvarim, and now he quotes again, this is from the Torah, book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, Hashem badad yinachenu, the Lord will guide them by themselves, right? Now this really could mean the Lord alone will guide them. I believe you could translate it that way too, but the way Rashi's looking at it and the tradition is looking at it as that this badad alone, right, is to guide him alone, is referring to Israel in support of what Rashi's just explained. Ha'umot ovdei Galilim, and when the idolatrous nations, and I think for me, it's significant that Rashi defines them as the nations of idolaters, which to me then means only those nations that practice idolatry and not simply every other nation. But betova, when they are prospering, right, when they are good, experiencing goodness, heim ochlim in kol echad ve'echad, and this I had to look up a translation of this to try and understand what it meant. It's not that I had difficulty with the Hebrew, right? Literally, it's easy enough to translate. They enjoy, right? They literally, ochol means to eat, but it means essentially they partake with each and every one, kol echad ve'echad. And what it means is that, interestingly enough, this is the translation I read, that it says that, in other words, that the Israelites are able to, that Israel is able to benefit at that particular moment. Ve'ein oleh lahem. So this is, again, a way of understanding this. I believe this is a ambiguous Rashi here, and I could give you an alternative statement, but basically the way he's understanding is ein oleh lahem, that the lahem to them refers to the Israelites, right? Min hacheshbon, from the amount. So this actually tends to make it easier to understand this particular translation. What it's saying here is that there is a sense that whatever we enjoy in this world, whatever benefits we get in this world, there is, it's like there is a certain measure, a certain amount of reward and punishment to be meted out. And frankly, you want your reward in the next world. You don't want to take your reward early, right? You want to save it. You want to pay whatever prices you have to pay for whatever misdeeds you have performed in this world. You want to take whatever punishment, quote punishment, or accountability in this world and not wait for the next world. One very simple reason is this life in this world is so brief, and our existence in the next world is, for all we know, infinite. So essentially what it's saying is that this particular interpretation is understanding this to mean that while the Israelites are able to benefit, it doesn't necessarily subtract from the merits that they are to inherit in the next world. Let me just finish this up. Vezehu, and this is what is meant by uva goyim lo yitchashev. They will not be accounted for amongst the nations. I'm going to look at the chat that okay, all right, I see, all right. So this is, you can see how complicated and how full this particular material is as we try to go through it. So I had another thought about this, but whether it'll be supported by everything that Rashi says, we'd have to play it out, all right? So because he had said basically that the fate of the Jewish people is not the same as the rest of the world, right? He was saying here that when these idolatrous nations are enjoying success, right? Heim ochlim in kol echad echad. I was understanding as this heim as referring to these other nations, right? And in a sense saying that they enjoy it together. Each and every one enjoys it. Ve'ein ole lahem min hacheshbon. And here, though, somehow understanding this, okay? And of course, I'm going to probably hold with the first interpretation, right? So somehow the lahem here being the Jewish people, right? And the Jewish people don't have to, they don't have to use up whatever merits they have attained. So it's probably a strained interpretation, and the first interpretation that I gave is the primary interpretation. Even so, if you're somewhat struggling with this, I can assure you that I am as well, and there's a lot to think about with regards to this. And I'm going to stop here. I'm going to move this to here. And I guess next year we'll move on to the next verse. We'll be ready to move on to the next verse. So this is this first quote, curse of Bilam. Obviously, it's not a curse. We'll see that Balak does not take it as a curse. He does not misunderstand it. But let me stop right here. All right. Any thoughts or questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
Why does Balak insist that Balaam
Yes.
go to 3 different positions to
Ah.
see the Israelis camp below their border? I don't understand why he does that.
So that's a very good question, Harlan, and it's actually dealt with in the commentaries, in that Balak was thinking possibly that depending on the various groups, whether or not they might be cursable, okay? And in fact, in the last place, I think he only takes a part of the Jewish people rather than the entire group, hoping that the curse, that Bilam will be able to curse them. So that in a sense, again, trying to extrapolate from this whole thing that we're dealing with here, that God's concerns and God's protection for the Jewish people is even for a small number. They don't have to be all together necessarily to merit the blessing, that even a small number of them can still be worthy of divine protection, primarily because of our ancestors. So as I said, in a previous session, maybe this was in response to what David was asking yesterday, that it has to do with the fact that we realize as we go back over Jewish history as we understand it, or the Jewish experience, there's been so much suffering involved. And that in a way, this wants us to hold on to the fact and recognize that even though we may not be aware of it, and despite whatever suffering we might experience, that in fact God is protecting us and preventing it from being even worse. And just the openness and the strength, the inner strength to admit that whatever suffering we are doing has its reasons. Again, I explained this yesterday, the two theories. One is that it's in a sense, punishment, paying for the sins we have committed, and the other that it is actually a merit that says that that we are taking the suffering that people are trying to attack God, and we're the closest thing. So because of what Judaism represents and its beliefs.
Another positive thing, way you could see punishment as positive. And, I have, as a teacher and a student of psychology, I am like really not for most punishment the way it happens.
Right.
But as far as some kind of disciplinary, or approach, and in my opinion, therapeutic approach would be best. But the point is that someone has to care about you, to want you to be their best. And if someone didn't care, it's just, there's no point to dealing with you at all.
Yes, that's an extremely important point, and it's one that is brought up when we read about the blessings and the curses. I would add another thing too, Lauren, and thank you, and that is that teaching us accountability is in some ways essential if we're going to experience happiness. To know, because accountability is another kind of significance, and that every single one of us is accountable, that our lives, because it's tied up with purpose.
Also, it's not just accountability, but if there were no adversity, we wouldn't recognize happiness as happiness. It's got to be a whole spectrum of emotions and things that we're dealing with.
Right. You can't be, I don't know. Maybe joy is simply an emotion, right? But the trouble is sometimes people confuse joy with giddiness, and sadly a level of stupidity and destructiveness. Where do you get your joy from? But I think knowing that we are capable of being accountable is a huge thing. But I appreciate what you're saying. I totally agree with you with regards to adversity. But the fact that, if in fact we are here, that the purpose of being here is to learn, right? Well, learning that we are accountable is a great, great lesson, and a wonderful lesson. So let me stop the recording here, and to be continued.